All right, we're live. Welcome to A Fresh Perspective Live. I'm so happy to have as my guest Dr. Nijay Gupta, Senior Translator for the New Living Translation. And as we get started here, before I officially introduce my guest, I just want to make sure as people are coming in that you can hear me and everything's working correctly. I believe it is. And let us know where you're watching from. It's just good to kind of see you in the comments there. Also, we're going to be taking questions today. If anybody does have a question as we have our conversation, we'd love to hear any questions that you have. But let me just let everyone know about our guest today. He is a professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary. He's authored several academic books. He co-chairs the Pauline Theology Seminar of the Institute for Biblical Research, and as I said before, a senior translator for the New Living Translation. Welcome, Nijay.
Thanks, Tim. It's great to be talking with you today.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really do appreciate it. And you're going to be a rep today for the New Living Translation.
Yes, happy
So
to.
I kind of hinted at this a little bit before, but a lot of people who watch my channel would probably lean more toward a conservative approach to translation, or I should say a word for word approach, not necessarily conservative, but
Yeah.
that kind of thinking. And so it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on the New Living Translation and just see if you can get the audience thinking about this some. But I do want to welcome people that are writing there in the comments. We got Daniel, thank you for letting me know about the sound. Watching from Wales, United Kingdom. That's awesome. So we got an international thing going on here. And then, of course, we've got the U.S. represented. Connecticut, where I am, is New England. So, fellow New Englander, good to see you there. And we also got someone here from Wisconsin that wrote. So, hello to Wisconsin, Jeff. Very nice to see people in the chat already commenting. I see more people coming in on my end. I can tell people are watching. So why don't we just get started? Let me ask Dr. Gupta. He said I could call him Nijay. Nijay,
Yes, you can.
yes. You're working currently at Northern Seminary as New Testament professor. And how long have you been there?
This is the end of my fourth year. So basically, we got through the pandemic, and now we're on the other side of
Wow.
that.
That's good to be past that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you've also authored books. So what's your most recent book? What have you worked on?
Yeah, my wheelhouse is the Apostle Paul. I am a generalist, and I love studying across the whole New Testament, but I tend to focus on my commentaries on Paul's letters. Most recent
Hmm.
book is with a new series with Zondervan called The New Word Biblical Themes. I wrote on Galatians. I'm the series editor. There's going to be 20 volumes, a bunch of different authors. What I really love, Tim, is to provide resources for pastors, Christian leaders, for Bible study, for preaching, for teaching. So this is walking you through three of the most important themes in Galatians, of course, Christology, but under that umbrella, faith, family, and freedom. Really important topics in the Bible.
Yeah, that's great. So you're teaching, you're writing, and then you're doing interviews on different channels and so on. Oh man, that's great. So I mentioned too about the Pauline Theology Seminar
Hmm.
of the Institute for Biblical Research. That piqued my curiosity because I'm not sure what that is actually.
The Institute of Biblical Research is a group of evangelical scholars. There are probably about 700 to 1,000 people in the membership list. And we get together once a year during the annual conferences in November.
Hmm.
ETS, Evangelical Theological Society, SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, and IBR, Institute of Biblical Research. And we have little working groups. And so my working group is Pauline Theology. We'll invite some scholars to come in, give some presentations. We'll have a good discussion. Usually that leads to a book publications. We've done work on Paul's theology of sin. We're currently studying right now Paul and Judaism, Paul's relationship with Judaism. Really important subjects that help us better understand his thinking and his writings.
Cool. It's good to actually hear what some of these things mean when I see it in your bio. Now let's get to like the real subject here. You're a
Sure.
senior translator for
Yeah.
New Living Translation. So what is a senior translator?
Yeah, there is a group of us on a committee for Bible translation. I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say there are about 15 of us. And some of them work for the publisher, Tyndale, and they are kind of representatives of the publisher, the main person there being Mark Taylor. Some of them are stylists. Their professional job is kind of in the territory of good writing and grammar and things like that. And then about half of the committee members are biblical scholars. So some of them are Old Testament scholars. You may know the name Tremper Longman or John Oswalt or Daniel Block. And then some of them are New Testament. And actually, all the people right now in New Testament are new, because there's been some retirements and even sadly some people have passed away. So on the New Testament, we have myself, we have Dr. Lynn Kohick, and we have Dr. Amy Peeler. And so we we meet on a regular basis to talk about changes that need to be made, that sort of thing. And we're currently working on a long-term investment in a major revision of the New Living Translation.
Wow. So it'll be the New Living Translation.
The New Living
Yeah.
Translation. It's going to be, I call it 3.0. They were published back in the 90s. There was a moderate revision done in the early 2000s. We're going to do a pretty significant revision because it's been a good number of years. And by the time it's published, it'll probably be about 15, 20 years since the second edition. So it's time.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I did a video on the New Living Translation, and I mentioned John 3:16, I think it was, and
Mhm.
kind of the rendering of that. And I didn't realize the edition that I had was a little earlier edition.
Yeah,
It
could be.
wasn't old, but it wasn't the most recent edition. And
Mhm.
so when I kind of made a comment about that, someone in the comments said, "Oh, it's this. It reads different in the New Living Translation than what you said, and it's because they changed that in John 3:16." So already there have been revisions, as you said, but is this one going
Yes.
to be even more extensive than what's done before?
I think so. I don't know how much I'm allowed to say, but with so many
Yeah.
new committee members, they've brought in another younger group of committee members, just thinking we need more energy. Some of the committee members are in their 80s and late 70s, and so bringing in younger people who know maybe the cultural language a little bit better of American society, things like that. Yeah, we're not looking to change major things, change biblical texts, but we're looking to is just improve and update the text with where the exegesis is, that where the exegesis has been maybe sometimes for decades. And it just takes energy and work and rolling up your sleeves. So we're doing that now.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So what? It'll just be interesting to see, what kinds of changes. As you said, you're not looking to just change it for change sake, but really to
No.
yeah. But that is really interesting. And by the way, again, people, if you have questions that you want to follow up with here, anything that just sparks a question in your mind, or you need some clarification, you can put that in the comment section. I'll try to pay attention to that. But as Nijay was saying, he's working on the committee for Bible translation for the New Living Translation, and they are going to make an update. I don't know if you have any idea of what is it just going to be like the New Living Translation, and then the copyright will be updated as far as you know.
Generally, that's how it works. I mean, when people, for example, open the NIV, they don't refer to it as the NIV 2011. They just refer as the NIV. Right away, there may be language around it being new. But if I don't know what software you use, but I use Accordance. And in Accordance, it differentiates the major versions. So, for example, with the NASB, it'll differentiate the newer version from an older version. That would happen, but when you buy it in the bookstore or from Amazon, it's not going to say this is a different
Yeah.
version. my sense is the publisher will retire that old version, but some people will still have the older version, and that's okay. When I read the New Living Translation now, there's nothing that stands out to me like, oh no, this is heresy. It's just a matter of making lots of little improvements. It's kind of like a new operating system. I'm a big Mac guy. It's a new operating system. They're not telling you the old system is, going to get you killed or get your bank account information stolen. They're always just correcting little bugs.
Yeah. And we did actually have a question about the time frame, which you may not know, but maybe you do know.
I don't know if we've been told as the committee. We're just getting started. I would say don't expect it to hit shelves for 7 to 10 years. These are
Yeah.
long
Yeah.
undertakings. This is like my kids will be well out of college by the time this hits. So, it. I didn't realize until I got into this just how much work it is and how many people are involved and how much double, triple, quadruple checking takes place.
Mm,
It's a lot. When I signed on, it's like a big chunk of your life will be devoted to this, which I'm happy to do because I think it's so important.
that's great. Yeah. You mentioned that the NLT is probably just going to be the NLT, like the NIV is just the NIV. There are translations that take a different approach. Of course, the NASB has been, really kind of clear. Every update they do, they usually put the year behind it. So there's the NASB 77,
Yes.
the NASB 95, but also there was one that I was thinking of and it just escaped me. This is late afternoon where I am, so my brain's not working very well. But yeah, there are some translations that actually do put
Indicate the
they
update.
do indicate. So that's interesting. Oh, you know what? The NRSV is what I was going to say. The NRSV
Oh,
UE, you know?
if it's a significant enough update, sometimes they do that because they definitely want people. See, I think part of the reason that the NRSV does that is it's used a lot by academics, and academics get really finicky about making sure they get the most up-to-date, accurate information. That could be one of the motivations behind using that terminology.
Yeah.
I can't speak for Tyndale on whether they'll change the name or not, but it's very common for publishers to go through updates and not change the name.
I think it really depends on the market, the kind of your target market.
Yeah.
Like you just said, academic, and the NASB is academic,
Yep.
NRSV is considered
Yeah.
academic. So you can kind of see why their audience
They
is
want to
going to be like,
know.
"Oh, I want
They
to
want
know
to know. Yeah.
which edition I'm using."
And I will compare when I'm doing academic work, an older NASB to a newer one. I'll compare what changes they made because I'm curious, what was
Yeah.
before and why they changed it. So, and a regular Bible reader, layperson isn't going to be that finicky.
Yeah. Well, let me just take a moment to let everyone know that I am going to give away a couple NLT Bibles this week. And one of them is just the church Bible here. Very nice copy. And also a large print soft cover that's very nice. And if you want to enter for a chance to win one of these Bibles, as it says there on the screen, just write to afreshperspective@gmail.com. And in the subject line, write NLT Bible. That's all you have to do. You don't have to write me a message. You can if you want to. You can say something, but as long as you put those things there, then I'll know that you want to be entered for a chance to win a New Living Translation Bible. And I'll try to announce that, I think, a week from today, which will be May 17th, 2024. All right. So I'm curious as to how you got involved. How did you come to be part of the New Living Translation Committee?
By the grace of God, Tim, by the grace of God. I mean, I used to think that Bible translators have some special certification, and generally speaking, they don't. They're just respected and accomplished biblical scholars. So they have done enough work in their field to gain a reputation for good trustworthy biblical scholarship. And so I think I don't actually know why they invited me, but I would assume it's because I've written some biblical commentaries. Prior to joining them, I'd written commentaries on First, Second Thessalonians, Philippians, Colossians. I wrote exegetical study in the Lord's Prayer. And so they can look at that work and they can say, this person is very thoughtful about the exegetical process. Their Greek is really good. I think a big part of it is how well do they play nice with other people, because we're a committee. And I've already been to one major meeting, which we had last year. We're going to have another one coming up soon. And we disagree, Tim. And
Do
we don't
you?
disagree in really mean-spirited ways, but we have our opinions because we're biblical
Yeah.
scholars with expertise and passions. And
Mm.
we're very nice about disagreeing, but we get into it and then we start saying, should we do it this way or that way? And then we ended up taking a vote. I didn't realize how much of this is by vote, but I think that's good because you have
Mm.
to make a decision at the end of the day. I remember,
Mm.
I won't give you details, but there was this Hebrew word, and there wasn't a perfect word in English for this Hebrew word. And so we threw out a whole bunch of options, and then we're kind of just weighing the positives and negatives of each option. And it was this really small thing, but we spent like an hour trying to
Yeah.
decide what's the best English translation for that that's going to lead to the least amount of misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And just multiply that by 1,000, and that's what we have to do every year.
Wow. I love that you're bringing out the detailed work that it has to be done.
Mm.
A lot of people complain and they get very, kind of hung up
Yeah,
on
yeah,
things when it comes to
finicky.
translations. And I think, we're all coming from something. And if
Yeah,
we're used to something, I think it was the King James translators actually, and I'm paraphrasing, they said something like, people don't like what they have, but they can't bear to have it changed,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know, right?
yeah, something like that.
And
Even
so,
even things like a comma, like we could have discussions like recently we had one about a hyphen versus a comma. It's tedious, but these are the things that eventually become the Bibles that people read. So we take it with the utmost seriousness.
that's awesome. So I'm just going to go ahead and put some questions up here that we got from one person, and it says, "What makes the NLT unique among existing English language translations, and what is the driving force behind a new revision? What areas can be seen as needing improvement?" I mean, you don't have to give us
Yeah,
a
yeah,
ton
yeah.
of
All the
detail on
dirty
that, but
details.
yeah, yeah.
Um, this is a great question because I think people are curious how different translations are different. So the old language for how we differentiate different translations is literal versus dynamic. But that's kind of misleading because it can
Hmm.
make it seem like dynamic is sort of a free for all. So now the scholarly language is formal equivalent. Formal equivalent means how can I find formally the most similar word in English to the Greek or Hebrew word? And that would be things like the NASB. Although we could talk a little bit about how I think that all translations are making really important choices. On the
Hmm.
other end, you have what's called functional equivalent. So it may not be choosing the exact same word, but it's trying to express the exact same idea. And that's going to be something like the New Living Translation. So then the question is, why are translations different? Well, it's really the intent of the translation. Some translations really want to show you the Greek. They want to show you the Greek without you knowing Greek. And so they're going to try to translate it as close to word for word as possible so that you know as well as you can what the Greek says without knowing Greek. A more functional equivalent is saying, okay, the goal isn't to know the Greek, it isn't even to know the kind of minutia, but to say, how does it read? How does it read? Let me give you an example. In Hebrew, if you want to say how are you, you'd say mashlomka. And mashlomka, if I was saying mashlomka to somebody and you didn't know Hebrew and you said, what did you say? I would say that I was saying, how are you? Because that's what you would want to know. But what I'm actually saying is, what is the condition of your peace?
Hmm.
So when you ask me, what are you saying? If you're wanting to learn Hebrew, you want to know exactly what I'm saying. But if you want to be able to communicate or understand our conversation, you just want to know what I'm saying functionally.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Totally makes sense.
And so the NLT is trying to do that. So we'll sit around saying, okay, they're using this phrase. How would we say that? And so let me give an example. I don't know if the NLT does this, but I'm giving you an example of what I think of a functional equivalent. So if Jesus says to Paul, it's not good for you to kick against the goats. Most people aren't going to know what that means today. So instead of death by a million footnotes in a study Bible, you could just say, it's no good for you to go against my grain or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Where we're trying to say, okay, how can we get there in a way that's going to make the most sense to the target reader? NLT is going to be more comfortable doing that on a regular basis than something like the NSB. It's not that the two are against each other, the NSB and the NLT. I see it as they have different functions in terms of how a Christian uses an English Bible.
Yeah, it's really good. Now, anything you want to say about the driving force behind the revision that you were talking about?
I would say the main driving force is just time. The longer a translation goes, the more it feels outdated with the language of the people. And so you have to think about two things. One is how accurate is our interpretation of Scripture? And we're always making little changes to become more and more accurate. Let me give you just one example. And I'm not talking about the NLT, but I'm talking about biblical interpretation. In First Thessalonians, Paul says, God's will is for your sanctification or your consecration, that each of you learns how to control his own. And the Greek says skeuos, which means vessel, with holiness and honor. What does it mean to control your own vessel? Well, the most popular interpretation in the 1970s and 80s was that it meant your wife. But newer scholarship, including work I've been doing in the last 20 years, 10 years, has said it's actually probably talking about the body and specifically the male organ. And so vessel would be a euphemism. That would be an example where we would want to change the translation. We don't do it on a whim. We look at the commentaries. We look at whether that interpretation has been out long enough to create a consensus, whether the evidence is rock solid, which I think it is. And then we say, okay, this is better. There's so many choices that have to go into this. What is the better? We could just put vessel, but that's not going to make sense to people, even though that's what Paul said. So we often try to get to a bottom line with that. Even an NIV is going to try to do that. NASB is probably going to retain the word vessel because that's what's in the text. But most translations are going to try to actually explain it in a way that's meaningful. So one end of it is the exegetical. Are there interpretations that have won the day in the last 20 years that need to be updated? And the other one is the English language. English language has changed over time. I'm going to give you a controversial example here, Tim. Gender language. So, for example, when Jesus says, if anyone believes in me, he will have living water, come out of him or something like that. Should we say he? So we're asking two questions when we ask, should we say he? Number one, we're asking, what does the Greek say? And is it accurate to the Greek? But then we're also saying, how do people receive it today? Is it going to make the most sense? And so that's when we get into the issues of gender accuracy, gender neutrality, some of those things. It's complicated because we're not just asking what's exegetically correct, but also how is it being understood by the people reading it? And that changes over time.
Yeah, and what I've noticed about gender language is, in some ways, it's a little more challenging for the formal equivalent translations, because they have to be exact about each pronoun, and then there's do we use a male pronoun here, and were they really trying to convey a male idea here, or was it more general? Whereas when you have a translation that's consistently functional in its approach, or traditionally we call dynamic in its approach, those things tend to be obscured more. You don't actually notice it as much, even when it is being more gender inclusive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In Greek, the masculine form of nouns, pronouns, things like that, did not communicate masculinity. It was just the
Hmm.
default setting, which happens in Spanish and German, other languages. But in English, we tend to associate male pronouns with maleness,
Hmm.
which is why we're less likely to use mankind because of the associated male. We use humankind and that sort of thing. So we
Hmm.
run into some of those challenges. And you're right, a formal equivalent is going to have a hard time knowing exactly what to do with that. Whereas a New Living Translation can use certain tools and tricks to get around even having to do that, whether it's changing a singular to a plural.
Hmm.
Let them take up their cross and follow
Yeah.
rather than let him. English
Mm.
forces us into these decisions,
Yeah.
and I think it's okay to make some of these choices to use language that's going to make the most sense to the readers.
Yeah. Another question we got. We live in an area with very low literacy and chose to use the NLT to make it more accessible to people in our area. Does this go into the committee's decisions on translation?
100%, and this is actually a major priority, is biblical literacy. There's one thing which is actual literacy. And we do care about that, and we do pitch NLT a little bit lower than some of the other middle
Mm-hmm.
group, more kind of King Jamesy sorts of translations. We want to make it really understandable, but I think another part of that, and I think this may go into that question, is we try to get away from Christianese. We still use historically important theological terms, but we really try to make it so that an unchurched person will understand the biblical text. Because when Paul was writing letters, when the Gospels were being circulated, they didn't have Christendom, they didn't have Christian dictionaries and all those things. So we wanted to break that down and communicate in as plain American English as possible, or Western English as possible.
Hmm. Yeah, New Living Translation is really good. It reminds me of what Dave Brunn was talking about last week. If people didn't see that, you can watch last week's interview. He translated to a language in Papua New Guinea,
Hmm.
and I pressed him a little bit because I think a lot of people in an American audience really can lean strongly to a more literal or word for word or formal approach, as you put it. And he said, there they don't have a lot of resources, so that Bible being clear to them right off the bat is so important. And maybe that's what I'd like you to do for an American audience. On top of anything you've already said, is there anything you would add to the case for why the New Living Translation is an important tool in our setting?
Yeah, yeah. I have so much. I have like pages of information here for you, Tim. When I first started working with the NLT, and we met with together for the first time in my experience, we had a phrase that we use a lot, which guides what we do, and the phrase is exegetically accurate and idiomatically bold. And I want to emphasize the idiomatically bold. One of the problems with a more formal translation is the Bible was written a lot in artistic and beautifully written prose and poetry. And sometimes in our efforts to translate that formally into English, we lose the beauty.
Mm.
One of my Old Testament professors, Walter Kaiser, used to say, reading Hebrew and English is like paraphrasing poetry. You get the
Mm.
gist, but you lose the beauty. And what we try to do with the New Living Translation is we say, how can we both translate it faithfully and also make it beautiful in the way it was beautiful then? Let me give you an example. And I don't know if this is actually true in the New Living Translation, but this is the kind of thing I'd want to see. If something rhymes in Greek, I would love to find a way to make it rhyme in English. Does that make sense? Or if
Hmm.
there's alliteration in the Greek, and there is sometimes, like in Philippians 3, where he says, watch out for the dogs, watch out for the evil workers, watch out for the mutilation. In Greek, it very clearly is a poetic form. Then I would want to do something to make it pleasing in that same way, or
Hmm.
interesting in the English. Poetry, the Christ hymn, the Philippian Christ hymn, the Colossian Christ hymn, the hymn in First Timothy. I'd want to find a way to make that noticeably poetic.
Mm.
And when we try to do word for word, sometimes we lose that because we're doing something we think is mechanical. And I don't want to lose that. So I would say one of the big advantages of the New Living Translation is that. I would say another big issue with the New Living Translation is sometimes with the translation, you want to build in not just the text, but also a bit of the culture. As kind of a way to give someone a foothold or a support for their understanding. So I'm deviating from the New Living Translation here because haven't memorized it. But for example, when Paul, I've done a lot of work in Philippians, these examples come to mind. When Paul says, "Watch out for the dogs," I have my own translation of Philippians I put in commentary. I put, "Watch out for the wild dogs." Now, the word wild isn't in the Greek, but when people today think of dogs in an American context, they think of domesticated dogs, like a poodle or a
Yeah.
puppy. And when Paul says, "Watch out for the dogs," in that culture, dogs weren't domesticated.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're talking about dogs roaming around the streets wild. And so he's saying, "Watch out for the wild dogs." I'm adding the word wild because it's culturally added in the mind of the writer and readers. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So the question is it okay for me to do that? Is it okay for me to add the word wild? I would say yes, because I'm trying to get my reader to the place that Paul's reader was.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's going to go beyond formal. But I do want to make a statement here, Tim, and I am being a little provocative here.
Go for
All
it.
translation, I'm going to do it. All translations integrate interpretation. All of them do, even the NASB. Let me just say, I love the NASB because of what it's trying to do. But if they ever claimed that they don't integrate interpretation, they're lying to you. I've never heard them say that. But if you ever hear someone say that, they're not actually speaking true. Let me give you an example. These are all from NASB. And again, I like the NASB. I want everyone to be clear about that. I use the NASB. But let me just give you some examples. Matthew chapter 5, verse 41. If anyone wants to sue you and take the Greek is chiton. NASB translate this as shirt. Let him have your himation as well. And the NASB translates this as coat. Now, technically, this would be tunic and an outer garment. But because shirt and coat makes sense to a modern audience, then that's what they do. Let me give you some other examples. Second Chronicles 15:7. The Hebrew says, "Do not weaken your hands." Do not weaken your hands. This is an idiom. So the NASB says, "Do not lose courage," and the NLT says, "Be courageous." So there, actually, the NASB and the NLT are pretty much trying to do the same thing. They're trying to interpret the idiom into something that makes sense to the reader. So they're not technically being formal in their interpretation. Let me give you another example. Exodus 34:6. The Hebrew, when it's referring to God's compassion and slowness to anger, the Hebrew actually says God's nostrils enlarge. But there's a reason that you've never heard that in English translation, because that wouldn't make any sense. So the NASB says slow to anger. Says slow to anger. So what the NASB is doing is they're interpreting the idiom to make it sensible to the modern reader. And that's actually what the NLT is doing, but it's just doing it consistently and everywhere versus just selectively where it feels like there's the least amount of understanding. So this is a practice used by all translators and translations, where we say, if something's not going to make sense to the reader, we're going to need to help. We're going to need to provide footholds for it to make sense.
So I do see one commenter who's kind of, I can tell, probably vying a little bit more for a explicit approach, where you can see maybe where there's things, but it'd be interesting for you to comment on this, because he actually, I think, gives this as kind of a maybe a suggestion, like, could you just put wild in brackets?
Yeah. And that's what you would do with a, let's say, with a commentary. But when we're talking about sending a Bible out to 50 million people,
Hmm.
the more you use these things like brackets, the more it can create confusion. People don't always understand what the brackets are for. So, for
Yeah.
example, with our Greek Bibles, we use brackets sometimes with words, and we use those brackets to show that we're not sure whether this word is in the text or not, meaning some manuscripts have it and some don't.
Hmm.
Uh, but academics are going to figure out what those brackets mean, whereas a modern reader isn't, and they might be confused. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that desire. When we're dealing with the NLT, if you actually pick up a paper copy of the NLT, there'll be footnotes, but they're
Hmm.
extremely rare. And we actually almost have a maximum threshold. We don't want to have a bunch of footnotes because these Bibles get used on phones and they get printed out and they get read. So we want to minimize the amount of the kind of tedium of over explanation, whether it's brackets or footnotes or things in italics, things like that. It's fine for academics. I think that stuff works really well for academics. We use that kind of stuff all the time. When it comes to a teenager like my 15-year-old or my 13-year-old reading the Bible,
Hmm.
I think the philosophy is they're going to stumble over these details. Again, what I go back to, I'm going to beat a dead horse here, Tim. What I go back to is different types of Bibles for different types of reading experiences. I think
Yeah.
if you're going to read the Bible through the Bible in a year and you just want to get the big picture,
Mm.
I think a New Living Translation is really, really good for reading through and understanding what you're reading, not stumbling over what certain terminology means or the density of the language. But if you're going to do
Hmm.
rigorous Bible study, which I'm sure everybody making comments is wanting to do,
Yeah.
then a more formal equivalent is obviously going to make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's going to serve you well. It's going to partner well with a Greek Bible, with a concordance, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But we try to keep the New Living Translation as simple and easy to read as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. A lot of it comes down to people getting used to using a translation a certain way. But I've noticed with my audience, and I can understand this in certain circles, there's a little bit of a suspicion about bias in Bible translation.
Yeah,
And maybe you could speak to this a little bit because I think the kind of the sense with some people is translations like the NASB, you don't have bias because they're literal. But
yeah,
translations like the NLT, there's just bias there. So
sure.
how would you respond to that and parse that out a little bit?
Behind every Bible translation, there's a million choices, and those choices are going
Hmm.
to be biased. Even with an NASB, and I don't fault it, they're going to have
Hmm.
to decide, how do I translate Phoebe being a diakonos? Do I say servant? Do I say deacon? Do I say
Yeah.
minister? I say helper. I mean, there's a million different ways you could translate it. And even though you're trying to be quote unquote literal, you're going to have to make a choice there. Right. And so those kinds of issues, let me give another example. Um, James, the name James in Greek is actually the Greek word Jacob, but we translate James by convention. So every time you read James, you're actually reading Jacob. Why don't we translate that as
Yeah.
Jacob?
Yeah.
It's because of Christian heritage.
Yeah.
So when you say, "Oh,
Yeah.
there's no bias there," why wouldn't they? If I were the NSB, I would 100% translate that Jacob because that's actually what's in the text. But they feel like they want to be consistent with Christian tradition. That's
Right.
fine, but
Yeah.
then just be clear. Just I hope readers are
Yeah.
clear. There's going to be that. Let me give a little
Yeah.
example here,
It's good.
but that's really important. The original Greek and Hebrew texts didn't have punctuation or spacing, even between words. That means every comma, period, question mark, exclamation point was put in there by a translator. They're making a million invisible choices about where that comma goes, whether it should be a question mark or an exclamation point. Paul will write in really long, sometimes 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 verse sentences where we stop the sentence. Some of the connective words like then, therefore, we sometimes have to add. Sometimes we drop words that are there that
Yeah.
are redundant. Let me give you an example
Mm.
from let's see here. Okay, this is from Galatians 1:20. Paul is saying what he's saying is the truth, and he uses an idu, which means behold. And the NSB translates it, I assure you, and the NLT translates it, I declare.
Mm-hmm.
So both of those translations are doing similar things. They're saying the
Mm-hmm.
idu isn't going to make sense as behold.
Mm.
So we're actually going to translate it in some other way that's equivalent to his point.
Mm-hmm.
So as anytime you're saying, oh, the NSV just gives it to me like it is, they're not always doing that. And I appreciate they're trying to do that.
Yeah.
But in so many cases, they're not. There's another issue
Mm-hmm.
here, Tim, with words that just don't make any sense in American English. So for example, Galatians 3:25, Paul refers to the law as a paidagogos. A paidagogos is an ancient slave that functioned in multiple respects: guardian, tutor, protector, disciplinarian. So translators are just sitting there going, which word do we choose? Because we're not going to put in a whole big explanation of a paidagogos. So in NASB, a King James, they're going to have to make some decisions. So the NSB chose tutor. That's fine. I don't think that's the best translation. I would probably say guardian would be the best
Mm-hmm.
translation. But just to say, your NASB translator is making a choice there. Now, if I saw them on the street, I wouldn't punch them in the face. I would just say, you gave it your best shot. I respect you. I appreciate the work you do. But they're making a choice, and I think they made the wrong choice. I'm okay with
Mm-hmm.
it. I don't think it's going to lead anybody down a path of sin. But they're making that choice, and we have to make a million of those choices.
Yeah. You make a really good point about bias toward tradition. I mean, I just think that's something that people could maybe chew on a little bit. And it doesn't make it wrong. It's not wrong to put a certain name that's traditionally used. Another one that I know has come up is the word begotten. And there are some people who have a real, strong theological trend toward that. They want to see that retained.
Yeah.
But some of the translations, they retain a word like that simply because it's tradition, even though they may actually, even the translators may say that may not be the translation we would use today if
Right.
that hadn't already been used. So I know that I just brought up a real controversy. I'm probably going to get people in the comments mad at me now, but I'm just, I've done a video on it before. It was actually it was interesting because John MacArthur, I'll just bring it up. John MacArthur in his commentary said, but begotten isn't the best word to use. But then in the NASB, as well as the Legacy Standard Bible, which produced by MacArthur and his group, still use begotten because it's tradition. So that's that bias,
Yeah.
I think. Anyway,
Well, one
that's
of my
my
favorite
take on it.
examples of that, Tim, is the Beatitudes. Blessed are or blessed be, and the reality is the King James was following the Greek wording, but in
Mm-hmm.
English we would say the poor in spirit are blessed. We would turn the language around to
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
sensible English, but we
Yeah.
follow sometimes the Greek
Yeah.
word order. But
Yeah.
most of the time, we don't follow the Greek. Even the NASB doesn't follow the Greek word order because it
Yeah.
doesn't make for good English. I call it Yoda English because it's like you're moving all the
Mm-hmm.
words around the sentence. But
Yeah.
sometimes they do. But my favorite example of the power of Christian tradition is hallowed be thy name. English translations love to retain that from Lord's Prayer because we recite it so much. I do think there's something beautiful about a recitation tradition, but
Mm-hmm.
it just doesn't make sense to people. If you stop somebody on the street and say, hallowed be thy name, what does that mean? I didn't know that when I was a teenager. I didn't know that as an early 20s person. I didn't really understand that until I learned Greek. And
Yeah.
so the question
Mm.
is, who's reading it? Are we trying to make that accessible, or are we trying to retain Christian tradition? Translators are in a tough place to have to decide those things.
Yeah, and I will say too with that, I don't think tradition is bad. Again, all translations have merit and strength and retaining. I've always said, but one of my favorite translations is the New King James because
Yeah.
it does retain so much tradition. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to like something to really kind of pick a lane, though. If you're going to be traditional. If you're going to be modern, be modern. But
Right.
that's just me. I tend to like that. I like the Christian Standard Bible. I think it's a really good mediating translation that's consistent in its approach.
Yeah, I agree.
But I do want to bring up another question that came up here. Samuel says, "Thank you for your work, Dr. Gupta.
Hmm.
When I encounter a verse that seems significantly different than other translations, how can I better understand the reasoning of the translators for the wording?" I've noticed some people get frustrated when they're like, "Why does this one version say something different than everything else?"
Yeah. Don't ask Chat GPT. That won't help you probably. But
Okay.
I would say, you know, that's a good question. As an academic, the answer is you look at Bible commentaries, but it depends on your
Mhm.
level of education, your ability to navigate those. I would say something like the NIV, NICNT, the New Interpreter's Commentary on the New Testament, is a
Mhm.
commentary series produced by Ehrmans. They're going to help
Mhm.
you understand those kinds of issues. It's going to
Mhm.
require reading some dense material, but that's probably the best route. Is there are dozens of different commentary series, but I'd recommend something like the NICNT, the New Interpreter's Commentary on the New Testament, that's going to break down those kinds of issues and explain to you why one translation is different from another.
Mhm.
I can't think of another great resource on that other than commentaries. A study Bible, a more academic study Bible, might get into that. So if you
I
look
do have
at,
a
oh yeah, go
I
ahead.
do have a
What do you got,
suggestion.
Tim? What do you got, Tim?
Mine is this is a simple one for probably anybody to do. You can go to Bible Gateway. There's a lot of
Hmm.
translations. Look up the New English Translation. It has the most
Yes,
translator
the
notes,
net.
and
That's right.
that often will at least tell you why there's a difference. If you look at the
Yes,
notes
that's a
in the
good
New
one.
English Translation, yeah.
I'm a big fan of the net, and whenever I do my own translation of something, it ends up coming out really close to the net. So I highly recommend that. And you're right; they have so many detailed notes. They're trying to serve linguistics, and they're trying to serve professional translators,
Yeah.
and they do a really good job with those notes.
That's my go-to whenever someone brings up like an unusual translation. That the footnotes for that translation does a really good job of at least explaining what the controversy might be.
Hmm.
All right. I did see something here, and I think we're getting a lot of questions. We're not going to get to them all today, but since I saw this one, I don't think it's silly, but someone was curious
No, it's
about
a
the
great
Dead Sea
question.
Scrolls. Does
Yeah.
it influence the NLT?
Oh, hugely. It influences all Bible translations because when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, we got just a huge cache of information that's in Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, and there may even be Latin. I'm not sure, but that material that was found gives us a lot more information about how these languages were used by Jewish communities around the same time as the New Testament. So for word studies, for understanding phrases, for example, the phrase "works of the law" that's in Galatians and Romans, we actually learned from a Dead Sea Scroll document called 4QMMT, which is a document for the Dead Sea Scrolls. We learned more about how this phrase was used at the time. So we learn a ton from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Archaeology is constantly giving us new material to help us
Hmm,
understand better the terminology that's used in Scripture.
very good. Now, we don't necessarily have time to get into this, but I do want to mention with this question, I've done a video giving a
Hmm.
little bit of the history of the NLT and where it comes from. We can basically say it started out as a paraphrase
Yep.
that was done years ago, the Living Bible, but then they decided to make it more polished, academic, really make
Hmm.
it an official translation, I think
Yep.
in the
Through committee
90s.
work. Yep.
Yeah. And so in the 1990s, it became the New Living Translation,
Yeah.
and they've continued to do updates. And Nijay is one of the committee members who's working on an upcoming update, the which we don't know for sure if it'll just be the New Living Translation or if they'll mark it in some way as being an update. All right, so yeah, I think we'll start to wrap this up because we do have a time limit here. I think we've really covered all the things that I thought were really important for our audience. I'll just say one more time that I am giving away a couple of New Living Translation Bibles. So if anybody wants a chance to win one of these Bibles, just email me at afreshperspective@gmail.com and write NLT Bible in the subject line. We've got this hardcover here and a softcover large print that I'm planning to give away. And these are compliments of review Bibles that were sent to me by the publisher. My brain's really not working. Tyndale, thank you. That's why I have you here.
Yeah.
So yes, Tyndale, thank you so much. And Tyndale actually helped to set up this interview, so I really want to give a shout out to them and thank them for making this interview possible. And thank you to the audience. It's been really good hearing your input in the comment section and questions that you've had. But most of all, thank you to our guest, Dr. Nijay Gupta. It's really been fun talking to you today. Thank you so much for coming on.
You as well, and the work you're doing with this ministry is really helpful in getting helpful information out to people.
I appreciate that. Well, I'm going to let the audience go now and say goodbye to you all. I really appreciate seeing you all here today. A lot of people in the audience, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye, everybody.